We're going to continue in our series through the Ten Commandments. We've been talking about and looking through each of the Ten Commandments, principles of relationship that the Lord has given to us. I believe that for too many of us, we view the Ten Commandments as demandments. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. God has given us commandments. He walks these principles for relationship. That's what this is all about. He wants to have relationship with you. He knows you by name. He wants you to know Him by His voice. And that's the reality of what we're talking about as we look at these commands, as we look at these principles that God has given us in His Word to live out each and every day of our lives. So we started with the first command, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And we saw that in that principle that God is very personal, and He wants to walk with you. He has already brought you out of slavery, and He's brought you and established you on some firm foundation in this life. And then the second commandment, when we looked at the second commandment, it had everything to do with our focus. What are we focusing on? He says, you shall have no other idols. So what are you actually looking at, and who do you have your focus on? And then the third commandment was one of identity. When He says that you shall not when He goes on to talk about you shall not bow down before those things, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. That word, His name in vain, means for nothing. That you're just kind of using you're carrying His name for no purpose. That you don't know who you are. There's an issue of identity, and the reality is when we use God's name in vain. In other words, we tend to say a lot that it's about cursing, and while that's somewhat of it, we talked about that last week. I would encourage you once we get that up there on the website, listen to it. It's more than just cursing. It's about the words that come out of your mouth. The identity that you're speaking, who you are, and then looking at that aspect of what God has truly called you to be, who He has called you to be as a son and daughter, and how do you carry that name out there. You know, Paul says that we are living epistles. We're living words of God. We're the living Bible. Every one of us is the living Bible. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Sabbath, or the principle of rest and refreshing. And it's something we all need. Particularly in this culture that we live in, it's so easy to get busy and then get busy by doing nothing. We get on our phones and we spend our time doing stuff that means nothing. And we never truly rest our mind. We never refresh our hearts. We never get to a place where we're truly at a place where we can hear from God, where we can breathe life back into this weakened body. And I think about my experience in the Navy. I know one of the things that when I was first enlisted, they told me you're going to take a swim test, and I thought, hey, I can swim. I learned how to swim at a young age. My father picked me up and he threw me into the deep end of the pool, and I learned how to swim. Anybody ever had that experience? Yeah? Well, kind of similar experience in the Navy. They have you go up on this platform. It's 20 feet above the pool. It's an Olympic-sized pool. You're fully dressed. They have you go up to the edge of the platform, and they say, all right, next. And you got to jump. Fully clothed, I jumped into the pool. There was so much going on. It was crazy. I dropped down, and the pool was about 12 feet deep. And I think I hit that thing pretty hard when I got all the way down in there. And I'm coming back up, and I'm losing sense of everything around me, because have you ever been there? Have you ever jumped in the pool, deep end of the pool? And you just kind of lose your senses. You lose your breath. You're gasping for air. You were pushed because it's next. You didn't really have time to take a deep breath and jump in and calmly swim up. No, you're paddling. You're trying to get up there, break the surface, trying to get air. And I was there. And then they said, all right, now swim to the other end of the pool. Swim. And I'm like, I can't. I'm trying to breathe. Anybody? Was that just me? We've all experienced something like that in life. Maybe it was that first career. Maybe it was that first job that you took on where you didn't feel qualified. And you probably weren't qualified to do what you were thrust in the deep end of the pool to do. And it takes a while for you to catch your breath. It takes a while for you to find a place, a rhythm. We're all people of rhythm. There's rhythm, natural rhythms in our life. There was a study done concerning your circadian rhythm. It's the way that your body reacts from throughout the day. I'm reading this book, a new book that I was referred to. It was New Thinking, New Identity by Sam Chand. And it's in it. He talks about how you've got to. There's certain rhythms of life that sometimes in the morning is when you're most productive. Sometimes in the evening is when you're most productive. But you need to understand your rhythm if you're really going to be effective in leadership or effective in life. For you to understand how your body works and how the rhythms of your life work. And for all of us, we all have a particular rhythm. My wife, her rhythm is not to wake up in the morning and jump out of bed and say, "Hey, I'm ready to take on the day." My wife's rhythm is at night. That's when she falls into her groove. She gets into her rhythm. Me, I wake up in the morning and I'm like, "Let's go." At night, I was like, I'm done. She usually says, "Yeah, it's you just ate dinner. You're checking out, aren't you?" Because I know my rhythm. She knows my rhythm. I know her rhythm. Because all of us, we have rhythms in life. But here's the most important thing, that God has instituted within us a natural rhythm. A rhythm in which we work, and then we must rest. Read with me in Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 8. He says this, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but on the seventh day, that is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gate. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy." I want you to pay attention to a couple of words here. He says, remember the Sabbath, and to keep it holy. And then in verse 11 he says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath, and he hallowed it." Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12. It's another instance in which God repeats the 10 Commandments. This is what he says. Now read with me. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. He says, "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and on it you shall not do any work. Your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your ox, your donkey, your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servants and your female servants may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave." Now look what he says. He adds this on his when he gives the 10 Commandments to Moses. The first set of commandments were destroyed when he comes down from the mountain. You remember that? And so he's re-giving these 10 Commandments. And this is what he says. This is not in the first set, but this is what he says. This is what he tells Moses. He says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." He says, you got to remember that you were once a slave. That you were once in captivity. You were once constantly laboring. Because in that culture, everybody, if you were a slave, you weren't given a break. You were expected to work. Work. This is interesting. Theologian John Walton reminds us that in this particular culture, they served these pagan deities, and these pagan deities did not love mankind. They needed mankind. They needed man to feed them. They needed man to do things for them. And so the expectation was that you were serving God all the time. And that because you were serving God, God needed you. And here's the reality: God does not need you. These gods needed man to feed them, man to take care of them. But when God spoke to the Hebrew nation, He contrasted that idea and that thought, opposite of the pagan gods, that man was a slave to the God. That man had to dig the irrigation ditches for God. That man had to plant the crops for God. That God didn't do it, man had to do it for God. But the God of the Hebrew nation, the God that we serve today, the God who has given Himself for us, has, instead of requiring us, because He doesn't need anything from us, what He has given to us is the freedom away from slave labor and moved us into a managerial role. He says, you are stewards of what I have given to you. Whereas the pagan deities, we were doing everything for the gods, and the gods required all this because it was their land. God says, this is a land that I am giving you, a land of promise, a land flowing with milk and honey. You contrast that idea. You contrast the reality of the God that we serve, that He doesn't need you, but He wants to have what? Relationship with you. He wants to have relationship with you. What we're called to do then is a sacred assignment. It is not slave labor. When you go to work, you're not working for slave labor. You're not working. I mean, some of us, we feel like it. It shows up in our paycheck. But you're not. You're working it as unto the Lord. And when you do that, God blesses you. Because you're not doing it because God needs it from you. You're doing it because He has a sacred assignment for you. So we're living this life then, as we work, as we go to work, as we spend time with our families, as we get involved in our churches. What we're doing is we're serving God out of a sacred assignment, not out of obligation or duty. Let me tell you this. If you're doing what you're doing out of obligation, rather than out of a heart and a compassion to do what you know that God has spoken in your heart to do, and you're just free to do it, and you're willingly giving of yourself, you need to change what you're doing. If you're not doing it with a heart knowing that what you're doing is a sacred assignment from the Lord, then you need to change what you're doing. We've got to take an opportunity for us to understand that God wants us to be His vessels that He uses for His glory and for His honor, but that we have an identity within Him. Our relationship is based out of our love for Him. So you say, Pastor, what about this Sabbath thing? What about this rest? You talked a lot about work, but here he's talking about rest. And that's an important part of our work. An important part of our work is finding times to rest. And so he says this, he says, I brought you out of slavery, and I've set you into a time in which you can rest. That's what Sabbath means. It means a day of rest. And this is why God gave us the Sabbath. And this is on your notes here, your first point. God gave us the Sabbath because He wants us to observe and reflect on what He has done for us. He wants us to observe and reflect on what He has done for us. So you say, well, then how do I do that? How do I observe the Sabbath? How do I reflect on the Sabbath? How do I remember the Sabbath? He says, well, out of that time is when you actually get into His Word. You spend time with your family. This is neat. If you actually look at the festival of the tabernacles, one of the feasts that God calls His people to. And listen, God wasn't a party pooper. If anything, God was a person who called His people to always engage in merriment and laughter, in times of fellowship. And the Feast of Tabernacles, He actually talks about that opportunity to be around others as an opportunity for Sabbath, for rest. So Sabbath is not just you going home, turning off the lights, and saying, don't bother me for the rest of the day. It's a time of reflection. It's a time of observation. It's a time of communion. It's a time when we get together with others of like precious faith. And we can worship God with each other, but there is no other preconceived agenda behind what we're doing. And we got to be careful that we don't take the Sabbath and create what the Talmudians, the people of the law, wound up doing with the Sabbath. That they wind up putting stringent expectations on people on the Sabbath. Sabbath became a religious object rather than a relational opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to have relationship. It's an opportunity to say, you know what? I've worked 6 days. I killed myself 6 days. I've been going at it for 6 days. But on this day, I'm going to breathe. I'm going to breathe in. I'm going to breathe out. It's a time for observation. It's a time of reflection. It's a time, number 2, it's an opportunity to remember our freedom. It's an opportunity to remember where we're from. Listen, this is interesting. Matthew chapter 2, verse 27. Jesus is healing people and setting people free. There was a person that had a messed up arm, and Jesus heals that person. The Sadducees get all upset. They get all mad. They call him before the council, and they're like, what are you doing healing people on the Sabbath? And this is what he tells them. He said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He says, the Sabbath, the time of rest was given to man, not man for the time of rest. You made a religion out of this thing, and now you've spiritually you've re-slaved, you've become a slave again to these observations that you have. And the Sabbath was actually made for us to understand our freedom in God. That we were called separated from the world. Every other pagan religion did not give a day of rest to their workers. But God said, even the person that is within your confines, your servant, must take an opportunity to rest. Even your animals, He says, must take a time to rest. Why? Because He knew exactly what we have found out in our mechanized world, that even machines need to take rest. If you work something over and over constantly without giving it downtime, it will burn out. And for many of us, we're living in burnout because we don't understand our freedom. Because we become slave to making money. We've become slave to appeasing people. We've become slaves to a mission or a vision or a purpose that is beyond what God has given you to live. You become a slave to it. So He says a Sabbath is an opportunity to remember that God has saved you. that God has called you, that God is giving you an opportunity to rest in Him. Matthew chapter 12, verses 2 through 8. Another opportunity where Jesus is encountering the same thing, healing people. And then the Pharisees saw it, and they said to Him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the day of rest. They're working. They're doing things that are not lawful on the day of rest. So He goes on to say, have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? How he entered into the house of God and he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are what? Guiltless. What were they doing? They were working on the Sabbath. They were doing what pastor does. They were having to do all the things. They were profaning, quote unquote. They were profaning the Sabbath. And this is what he's actually calling them out on what they had put as an expectation that they weren't even able to live out. He says, I tell you something greater than the temple is here. I tell you this, something greater than the temple is here. He says, and if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. And this is the most important statement he makes right here. He said, for the Son of Man is the what? He is the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, for some of us, we've encountered then people who say, well, then why are you taking this fourth commandment and you're not taking it literally? Why are you worshiping on Sunday and not Saturday? Well, those are, once again, these are those legal things that wind up getting people into some predicaments. See, the early church, what happened in the book of Acts, the early church wind up, they did meet initially on the Sabbath day, Saturday. Sabbath is where we get the word Saturday. And so they would meet religiously on Saturday. Jesus himself, as was his custom, would go into the temple on the Sabbath, the Saturday, the day of rest. But then the early church recognized that Jesus was ascended on the first day. So as they were worshiping on Saturday, they also chose to observe Jesus' resurrection on that Sunday. And so over history, over time, the church began to observe, to separate themselves from the Jewish believers, to observe our Sabbath on a Sunday rather than a Saturday. There's no major issue with that. The fact of the matter that God didn't say that on the seventh day you have to. He says you should have a Sabbath. You shall know the day of the Sabbath and you shall observe the Sabbath. So in other words, this is what he's calling to. He's calling us to periods and times of rest. As a matter of fact, the nation of Israel had gotten so far in their worship of the Sabbath that during the time that between the first kings and then their time into captivity, they actually didn't observe Sabbath. And so this is what happens. They weren't observing the Sabbath. God calls them out, and he does this in the book of Ezekiel. He calls them out about the fact that they weren't taking the Sabbath. And he tells them that for every year that they did not observe a Sabbath year, that they would be a year that they would be in captivity. You know exactly how long they were in captivity? 70 years. For the 490 years that they did not observe the Sabbath. That's an interesting fact. Because it's not about the day. It's about the fact that we need rest. That God has ingrained it in his people to find periods and times of rest. God wants you to be refreshed. As a matter of fact, listen to this. Exodus chapter 31, and I'm going to close with this. This is an opportunity for us to find our times and periods of rest. He says this, Exodus chapter 31, verse 16 and 17. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever, as a promise forever. It is a sign. Listen to this. He says, it is a sign between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. He rested, he took a Sabbath, and was refreshed. You say, well, this is God. Why does God need to be refreshed? God doesn't tire out, and that's the reality. He doesn't tire out. But the Hebrew word that's used there for refreshed is actually the word he took a breath. For 6 days, he breathed out. On the seventh day, he breathed in. And he was setting for us this expectation that on 6 days, you breathe out. You're working, you're toiling, you're doing everything that you need to do. And then on the seventh day, however that seventh day comes out for you, but somehow you've got to take a day to breathe in. You've got to take a day to be in His presence. Why? Because He's called you. Listen to this. He says this is an example. This is a sign forever. This is what He's saying to you. He's called you to be a steward of the most precious commodity that you have. It's a limited commodity. Time. Every one of us has been given the same amount of time a day. Every one of us has 24 hours. Every one of us experiences the same cycles of the sun going up and the sun coming down. We all take 1 year to make a revolution around the sun. And for some of us, we get a nice colored skin if we stay out there long enough. For other of us, my wife gets burned. But we all have the same opportunities. None of us has more time than the other. So this is what he says. Can you take an opportunity to be with me? Will you be a wise steward of the most precious commodity that I have given to every person on this planet? Your time. With every eye closed and every head bowed. I want to ask you today, have you committed your life to the purpose and the relationship that God has called you into? He is the Lord of the Sabbath. Let's not get caught up with the same way that the Talmudians did concerning the law, and they got to the place where they made it more than what it was. What this is all about is God calling you to times of refreshing, times of rest, and times of renewal. Times to be with your family, times to re-energize and refocus. Dr. Joyner was talking about the next generation and how many of us, because of our lack of rest, have caused the next generation to grow up without having a faith influence. We didn't take them to church. We didn't take the time to read the Bible. We didn't do what was expected of on the Sabbath, to take God's word and remind the next generation, hey, this is where we came from. We're free. Christ has set us free. And whom the Son sets free is free indeed. We need to take some time for rest. Will you commit your heart today to say, Pastor, I want to take a Sabbath. Maybe it's taking an opportunity to get away. You've worked for a month straight, but you need to take a day for each of those 4 weeks, 4 days to rest, refresh, get in His presence. Because it's not just about the spiritual impact, but listen, it has an impact on your body, on your emotions. It's all intertwined.